The reason this comes about, undoubtedly, is the vested interest in the establishment, and by this I mean the bullion banks, is to see lower prices for bullion and silver so they can close their shorts.
You also mentioned, so we've talked about financial and fiat currency strains and collapses. On the flip side of that are tangibles, real things, commodities, etc., that seem to be burgeoning, with the exception of silver in particular, but also somewhat gold. Eric MC asks a question that many are thinking. There seems to be no catalyst to drive silver and gold. Every headline seems to drive metals lower. Sure seems like manipulation. How can we escape the bank's control over metal pricing?
Patience is the answer. I'm sorry to say this. The reason this comes about, undoubtedly, is the vested interest in the establishment, and by this I mean the bullion banks, is to see lower prices for bullion and silver so they can close their shorts. The short position in the swaps alone on COMEX, I mean, has been in the region of sort of 40 to 45 billion dollars. I mean, we're talking about huge amounts. I mean, average bank exposure in the swaps is probably in the region of $1.5 to $2 billion. I mean, this is serious stuff. So they don't want to see a rising price for gold. What they want to see is a falling price, and they can then close them off. And what we've seen recently is some success for the swaps, because the level of open interest on COMEX has actually declined quite sharply from, off the top of my head, I think we got up close to 600,000 contracts, and now I think we're down to sort of 540, something like that. Maybe more to go from the point of view of the swaps. Now, the other thing I would say is that the investment world, the investment establishment, your favorite investment manager, the guy who runs your pension fund, the guy who's in charge of the insurance company's assets, they're all Keynesian. And so their response is always Keynesian. And what they're seeing now is there is risk, heightened risk in yen, euros, sterling even, whatever else they might have in terms of foreign exposure. So what do? What's the risk-free thing? To a Keynesian, the answer is quite simple, and that's the dollar. So you can see that instead of sensible people, I mean people who really do understand economics, understanding that this is a bigger risk thing which is likely to undermine the dollar as well, and bearing in mind that before this happened, foreigners already owned over 33 trillion. That's nearly 1.5 times America's GDP in dollars, in cash dollars, and also in financial assets. I mean, they're already up to there in dollars, and now they're going up to there in dollars, if you like. This is a very, very difficult situation. But if you're a Keynesian, where else do you go? They don't understand that the true hedge from this situation is actually physical gold itself. I mean, what they do is they say, I mean, if you're a Keynesian, you say, well, look, hold on a minute. We're seeing interest rates rising, which basically means that the penalty of holding an asset which produces no income is increasing. And you want me to hold gold? Now this is an argument they would prefer to see, because it drives down gold relative to the dollar. And if you're in the banking business, you say, whoopee, this is actually what we want. And so these are the dynamics behind what is actually happening. But the other thing I would say is that the comment that your viewer just made is, I would associate with someone who's looking at gold and silver as an investment. In other words, something that they would hope to sell at a higher price at a later date, rather than true money, which actually should be hoarded. And the reason you hoard money is so that you spend it later, because you're worried about everything else. So, if you like, I think that's the psychology behind the question. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. But what I would say is that the best way to look at this is you've got to hoard gold and silver, not worry about the day to day. If you see the big picture changing in favor of fiat currencies, then maybe you might decide to reduce your exposure to physical gold and silver. But I think that's extremely unlikely. If anything, I think the situation is intensifying. And as we've seen from the drop in currencies this week, I think it's intensifying very rapidly.
I guess maybe our last question then pushes a little bit farther here. Over the last 2 years, we've seen such a convulsive environment of emergency back on top of emergency, geopolitical strains, banking and currency, anomalies, that sort of thing. Bristleberger asks, under a worst-case scenario, governments may seek to nationalize gold and silver in, quote, the national interest. Are holdings more or less safe when held by private individuals or by businesses, such as storage vaults, if the government requires them to hand over bullion?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think that they will do this with silver. The logic behind the question is, of course, you've seen this in America before. We also had it in this country where the government turned around and said you can only hold 3 sovereigns or something. I wouldn't rule it out happening again. But the way to deal with it is to ensure that either you hang on to your gold and silver. Well, I can't turn around and say that you should break the rules that the government then introduced. But one way round this is to store it in vaults which are beyond the jurisdiction of your government. And there are 2 jurisdictions you've got to bear in mind in this. One is the physical jurisdiction. In other words, if you're an American, you might look more favorably in storing them in a vault in Switzerland. And the other thing is to make sure that you don't store them in a vault which is owned and operated by an American corporation. So that's another thing that you ought to bear in mind. And I would say that that's, one of the things we do at Gold Money is we offer a choice of, 11, 12 vaults or something around the world. So depending on your location, you can use that facility if you like. I mean, you're not going to necessarily stop your government from confiscating your gold, but you can make it just a bit more difficult for them to do so.